Good afternoon, everyone. I'd make it 3:30, so we'll get going. Welcome to Building Better, the session of the M&H Summer Series. And I apologise, as I have been in every session, if you've tuned in already, but I'm going to go through the same house rules yet again. If you could just make sure your microphone is on mute throughout, and then we'll be opening it up to questions at the end. Any questions you do have, if you pop them in the chat box with your name and organisation, we'll get to Paul and Tony's view on those at the end. So without further ado, in the interest of time, I'll hand over to our first speaker, Paul Brookes. Paul.
Thank you, David. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm sitting at the Box in Plymouth. It's a very sunny day. And for those of you who don't know what the Box is, it's a museum. It's also a contemporary art gallery. And it's also an archive, creating a permanent home for the region's film archive, as well as the region's photographic archive, as well as the city's record office, besides the museum collections and other collections within it. And I'm not going to show any slides. I'm just going to talk for the sort of next 15 minutes. And I'm not going to really talk about procurement either, because as a local authority run museum, I only have one thing to say about procurement. It's a nightmare. And so I'm going to talk instead about fundraising and the challenge, if you like. I'm entitling this talk the Jack in the Box story of raising funds to deliver a major capital project and some of the lessons learned from that. So basically the Box began its fundraising journey back in 2013 with a bid to the HLF in November 2013. And my apologies to all of you, there's going to be quite a lot of numbers here that I'm going to be talking about. But when we did that, before 6 months before I started here, when that application was done to the HLF, it was for one of their major awards for £12.9 million. And at the time, the budget was a £23 million project. But when we opened last year in September 2020, it had become a £47 million project. So it had leapt from 23 million to 47. So how did it get so much more expensive, and how on earth were the funds raised to deliver that? Now, the first thing to understand is that the Box was a partnership project, particularly with the region's film archive and photographic archive and the university, but it was led by the City Council. And we continue to be a local authority museum for very, very good reasons, for very good financial reasons. But crucial to our success has been the cross-party support of the Box throughout this journey. Especially for those of you who know Plymouth, administrations change between Conservative and Labour every 2 or 3 years. So I think over this 7-year journey, we're now in the 4th administration. And that the cross-party support has been at the top level. The leader of the council and the leader of the opposition have been chairing and vice-chairing my board throughout this journey and take incredible interest in every aspect of the design of the galleries and of the building. But back in 2013, Nicola Moyle, who led the project at the time, she was able to state that the council was going to be really generous and would contribute £3 million to this project, and they'd underwrite another £2 million of fundraising. And in that kind of optimistic stage of doing your first bid, where you desperately think, how are we going to raise the money? They sort of invented the rest of the fundraising strategy, and how to raise the other 7 million. They thought, well, maybe we can get £1 million from the ERDF. Maybe we could get £1 million from trusts. Maybe we could get £1 million from the Arts Council. And maybe we could get £2 million from sponsors. So that's what they wrote in the application to the HLF. And of course, that's optimistic in some stages and under ambitious in others, as I'll explain what then happened. So to everyone's surprise, I think at the time, we got a stage 1 pass on first time of asking. So back in May 2014, the good news came from the HLF. Wow, they're giving Plymouth £12.9 million towards this project. And then the really difficult journey of making everything happen really began. 2.5 years later, we submitted our stage 2 bid, and with an enormous amount of work in terms of different planning. That took us longer than we wanted. And one of the things that happened was building costs went up considerably during that time. The cost of materials, of steel and other things and so on. So the material costs went up. There were other reasons why our budget also went up, because we discovered that we completely underestimated the cost of what would be a sensible budget for gallery designs and gallery fit out. We'd only budgeted £1.5 million, and by the time we got to stage 2, I think we'd increased it to £3 million at that stage. But we spent a lot more than that in due course. So when we actually, in 2016, it was April 2016, we submitted our stage 2 bid. The budget had now become £32 million. So we've gone from 23 to 32 in 2.5 years. So inflation was one of the reasons why the budget had gone up. Another reason was, as to anybody who embarks on restoring historic listed buildings, whatever the initial surveys do, there's always other things that crop up. And yes, we also wanted to be more ambitious about the galleries, the designs of the galleries. So that was back in 2016. And then 3 years later, in 2019, as we were nearing completion of the building and beginning the fit out of the galleries, we were now on a £43 million budget. And when we finally did manage to open after lockdown 1, as I said, the costs had now risen to £47 million. So an extra £24 million on top of the 23 that we thought we needed at the beginning. So I've given you some of the reasons for additional costs, but there were others, and it was about our ambition. We wanted to be the best museum to open in the UK in 2020 as part of the Mayflower 400 commemorations. And our councillors and ourselves in many ways were bonkers. We absolutely wanted the best, and so whenever the decision came about, well, can we afford this or that, the councillors themselves would say to us, well, we want this, we want that, then don't you dare cut that. That sounds really good. The chief executive of the local authority, for her, it was an absolute nightmare, because constantly the councillors were telling her they wanted the budget increased. But the council would only increase its budget if we absolutely maximise resources from elsewhere. So how do we go about that? My journey basically began 6 months after. Well, 6 months after that initial stage 1 bid. I was asked to come on board basically as soon as we got that stage 1 pass. So I started in August 2014. And my first target was the Arts Council. I knew the Arts Council well from my career and everything else. And what I saw as walking around the museum as it was at that point, is still open. I thought, yeah, we're a museum and city art gallery. We are not just a museum. The project at the time was called the Plymouth History Centre, but I thought it's just as much about contemporary art as it is about collections and museums. So surely we can get more than £1 million from the Arts Council. I mean, obviously, at that period of time, the Arts Council's responsibility for museums was at an early stage. And so really our main argument to the Arts Council was about contemporary art than it was about being a museum. And always I found through my career, it's like it's my biggest period of angst when I think about how far can we push it? What's believable? Would they buy this or not? And so we had a meeting fairly early on with the regional director of the Arts Council, and sort of said, do you think 2.5 million you might be, when you open up your applications for major awards, do you think we might be able to get 2.5 million? Said max 2.5 million, absolutely top end. Well, when it did later on open up for stage 1, round 1 and round 2s of the Arts Council being, we in the end thought, well, we certainly can't go for the maximum award allowed, which was 5 million, but can we push it a bit more than 2.5? And in the end, I made the decision that we would ask for 4,175,000 because it just sounded not like 5 million and sounded probably as far as I could push it. I've lived to regret that I didn't ask for 5 million. But that at that point in time, and this is part of the lessons learned, I think it's always about timing as to what you can ask for at any, in terms of what confidence there might be in the project at that particular point in time. Meanwhile, you know, as I was sort of trying to describe, the costs of other things were going up through that period. We not just the restoration of buildings. When we actually started building works, we found the library, which had been, we'd vacated the central library. That was one of the first things in the project, was to find a new home for the central library, because we were going to use the library as part of the space. And then once we started demolishing the extensions that had been built after the war at the back of the library, we found that the library itself, the 1910 library, the Edwardian library, was from bomb damage. It had been had not proper foundations. We had to sort of put a whole range of piling under the library. This cost us a lot. Then there was a drainage for all the Victorian sewers and drains in the road, cost us another £1.5 million, because the South West Water said we had to fix them and everything else. And as all of these costs escalated, the tension around could we actually deliver this project, could we raise the money, was thinking this Arts Council grant then became absolutely crucial to us. And when they said yes to that, what, 4,175,000, we thought, phew, and phew. But meanwhile, in our discussions with the Heritage Lottery Fund, we had been sort of saying, well, look, we're going to ask more for the Arts Council, so can we go back to you and ask more from you as well? Which they were very resistant to. But we said, well, also the City Council, we said we would put in 3 million underwrite too. We'll tell you what, we're going to give the extra 2 million now. So we're going to put 5 million in. And so with a lot of kind of nervousness from the HLF, we then in our stage 2 bid asked for an extra 3 million. So we were asking for 15.8 million from the Heritage Lottery Fund and near enough 4.2 million from the Arts Council. Both of those applications came good in August, September of 2016. And that's when we got the permission to start, and then got into another whole nightmare of the problems of Victorian drains and piling up the library and everything else and so on. So now on this 30, whatever it was, I think 32 million pound budget that we were trying to deliver, but having secured 20 million through the Arts Council and Lottery and 5 million from the Arts Council, we still were £8 million short. And this is the journey always felt like this. We were always £8 million short. And of course, then Brexit came along. So our hopes had risen previously. We were thinking we were under ambitious to think of only being able to get 1 million from an objective 2 ERDF region, but that got completely scuppered, so we have not received any money from Europe as part of this project. But trusts, we were working on the trusts and foundations where we kept that target of £1 million pretty well consistent until the end. And we spent a lot of time with 1 or 2 trusts which were not successful. The Claw wanting a Claw learning space. After 2 years of working with them, redesigning things, etc., they finally said no to us. The Foyle Foundation said no to us. Now, I think that was particularly because, as a local authority-run museum, that was on our real challenge of being able to get trust money. But we were successful with the Garfield Weston Foundation, who, because we applied through one of our partners, the South West Film and Television Archive, that was a charitable trust. So in terms of making an application for the housing of the film archive, we received £250,000 from the Garfield Weston, and the Wolfson Foundation also gave us £128,000. So those decisions happened fairly early on, somewhere around 2016, if by memory. But we still had a big target to go. And then I think one of the things that was fortunate for us is being part of the local authority also means you get access to some of the big funds that become available to local government. and if you're seen as a priority within local authority plans, then you're sort of manoeuvred into that funding application. So as a government scheme of coastal communities, essentially about jobs and tourism, we were put forward as the council's only bid in a particular round of funding. We asked for 2.9 million and ended up getting £2 million, but that was funding that wasn't particularly difficult to get hold of. Another long, complicated application, but it was successful. But sponsorship, completely unrealistic target of having put in the original bid £2 million of sponsorship. I have been involved working in other cities in the past, in Milton Keynes, in London, in Nottingham and Leicester, and I know how difficult it is to get sponsorship outside of London. Milton Keynes was a bit of an exception, but Milton Keynes is a particular nature of a city, and has many national companies based within the city. In Plymouth, it's the only real source of is the dockyard and the naval base, and Babcock, the company that it runs the defence industry within the dockyard. And so after a lot of work and a lot of persuasion, we managed to get Babcock to sponsor our Port of Plymouth gallery. But I'm talking a very small amount of money, 20,000 a year for 3 years, as a sponsor of a gallery. We also did get some sponsors for our figureheads collection, but I'm talking in tens of thousands, and the total sponsorship that we have raised for this project from the commercial sector is less than £100,000. So you can imagine there's a huge gap still over these years, and we had real difficult times where we went through kind of inevitably some value engineering, and that value engine, but at most times it was a kind of painful process of essentially wherever we thought we might be able to make a saving, the councillors were saying, well, we don't want you to save that, so you've just still got to raise some more money. And so it continued through this sort of seesaw motion of where at least every time we did an application to somebody else, we could get the council to say they were underwriting the fundraising. So not promising to give the money, but giving us the time and saying, so long as you raise the money by the time we open, we're okay about that. And then they started another device, which is called service borrowing, which is where, well, you can, we will give you the money, but you'll have to pay it back from your revenue budget, but at a very low rate of interest, because we as a local authority get very low rates of interest on the money we borrow. So I've ended up borrowing money for when we decided to do a much better kitchen bar. We borrowed at 400,000 from the local authority, and I'm paying it back at 40,000 a year for the next 10 years. And then other service borrowing requirements, which I'm still arguing about as to how much we pay and over what length of period. We also had, very crucial to all of this in terms of going back to a local authority, was our programme manager. And our programme manager knew the local authority very well. He knew how to demonstrate there was a crisis and then how to solve the crisis. And then unfortunately for us, Gareth died suddenly one evening. He was at work with us in the afternoon, died that evening, no signs of any ill health, and that put us back sort of 3 months before we could find a replacement program manager. And it was another very dark time in terms of actually, can we ever complete this project, in terms of just in terms of delays, in terms of, you know, again, rising inflation, etc., etc. And one of the lessons learned, I think, for me, has always been is to have confidence and to have faith in if the project is a good project. I have always believed it attracts money, and the key is not to overcompromise, it's always to keep top quality as absolutely as the top of your agenda. And then something will come along somewhere, the rabbit will come out of the hat. And for us, the one that happened was somebody else died, and he had left his whole estate to the box, for the protection of the legacy of naval heritage. And there had been quite a lot of controversy in the city at the time when we renamed Plymouth History Centre as the Box, and we hadn't used the word museum in it. And there was a lot of the Navy and the Navy connections felt that the Box was an entirely inappropriate name. And yet this individual was a photographer who had been ex-Navy, and he wasn't particularly wealthy, but he left his house to the Box for the protection of naval heritage, and that house was sold for £300,000, and that came at a time when it was just so important for us to be able to have the confidence to be able to go back for further fundraising from the council. So I'm going to come to an end of this because I've sort of that was the dark times. But then, funnily enough, COVID hit us as well, and that increased costs, of course, as it will for anybody else who was trying to finish a project during the first lockdown. But on the other hand, the Arts Council's Kickstart scheme for capital things sort of alleviated most of those kind of costs. We'd gone back to the Arts Council again when they opened up their small capital awards. We had to do a deal with another visual arts organisation in the city because we knew perfectly well that we wouldn't get 2 awards in Plymouth. So we both agreed to reduce our ask, and we both sort of scraped through on a smaller request. But that sort of gave us another sort of 300,000 into the kitty from the Arts Council. And I'm now, as I look on, I can go onto our council server, and we still haven't signed off the budget on the capital project. We're on cost plan version 236, updated, every sort of couple of weeks over the last 7 years, and we're still trying to draw the line on that funding. But I'm not going to go into the story about the revenue funding because that was also, of course, happening alongside, and we became in the 2018-2022 NPO a band 3 organisation that was a major boost to us in terms of the revenue. I won't go into that story, but I just want to finish off with a few of the lessons learned. I think quality is absolutely essential. When I look back, I'm so pleased that we did so little value engineering, and where we did do it, I still regret it because I think we could have probably raised the extra finance as long as people, but we had to be seen to be doing some value engineering. I think to be brave at all steps about saying we wanted to be the best. We had a really clear vision in terms of what we wanted the box to be, and we at every decision about every design within the gallery, we said, is that going to meet our vision? But the other things for me, I would say it is about timing. There are times when you don't ask for money. There's times when you just know you've got to see yourself through that period and hope for a bit of luck somewhere where somebody, even if they just give you a £50,000 top up trust grant of some sort, it gives people confidence. It's a time to go back for bigger funding. So the momentum is what it's been all about for me. And hopefully now we've got a very successful project, which is very financially viable. And unfortunately for me, because I'm at an age where if I was 10 years younger, I would be absolutely not letting anybody take this job off me. But it is time for me to sort of semi-retire, go back to doing some consultancy work and getting involved with a few other projects. And I'm delighted that Victoria Pomeroy from Turner Contemporary will be taking over from me at the beginning of October. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much for that, Paul. And now if we head from Plymouth up to Derby, if Tony, you want to step in now?
Thank you. I'm just going to share my screen. I have got some pictures. If I can find where the presentation is. That's not it. All right, sorry. You share. If you chat amongst yourselves for a minute, the presentation I had has just disappeared. Can you all see that? Can you see that, David? Can you nod?
Yeah, that's perfect.
Okay,
thanks, Tony.
Thank you. Right, I'll crack on. So I'm Tony Butler, and I'm the Executive Director of Derby Museums Trust. And I'm going to be talking about how we made the Museum of Making. I am going to talk about procurement. There will be a procurement section in this. I'm not going to talk about raising money because that was such. Paul's description was Byzantine, so there's not as much for me to say about that. Before I start, I would say that Hannah Fox was our project director on this project, and managed this project magnificently. So she's taken a well-deserved month's holiday, which is why you've got me. But I'm going to be talking about this, how we made the Museum of Making. But to begin with, I'm going to go back to 1969. So a chap called Arthur Thorpe had been the curator of Derby Museums for 35 years, and he was curator during the Second World War, and he'd witnessed the beginnings of post-industrial decline. So he wrote a paper for the Public Libraries, Museums and Art Gallery Committee of Derby Council, extolling the virtues of establishing an industrial museum at Derby Silk Mill. At the time, Derby Silk Mill was what is widely acknowledged as the site of the world's first factory. It was originally built in 1721. It's now part of the Derwent Valley Mills World Heritage Site. And the quote on the side here came from his paper to the committee back in 1969. From those words, you can tell that you get a sense that Derby is a place full of engineers. Derby today has Rolls-Royce, Alstom and Toyota based here. So we make planes, trains and automobiles. The city's been a centre for manufacturing for 300 years. And even back then, the notion of a museum of manufacturing and industry was very prescient. So back in 1974, Derby Industrial Museum was founded on the ground on the first floor of the silk mill. And it featured the growth of industry from the foundations in 1721, early ceramics trade, to railway towns, and the role that Derby played in civil aviation by the likes of Rolls-Royce. But 37 years later, the museum was mothballed. By that time, it was of diminishing appeal, as you can see, lots of pictures, lots of engines, propellers, very traditional industrial museum, and its audience appeal was diminishing. Added to that were two failed heritage lottery bids the City Council had put forward back in the noughties. So in 2012, Derby Museums Trust was founded. So we were spun out from the local authority and became an independent trust. So now the trust manages 3 museums on behalf of the city and looks after its collections of cultural heritage. And I came into the organisation in 2014 as their first sort of long-term chief executive. So the mothballing of the silk mill gave an opportunity to reshape the building from the ground up. So we've instilled values of the organisation being asset-based and human-centred. Now that means that an asset-based approach takes as its starting points the existing assets and strengths of the community, particularly those inherent in community-based organisations and social networks. So we work really closely with makers and hackers, organisations like Derby Makers and craftspeople locally to build up a picture of what the museum might be. And Hannah also instilled this notion of human-centred design. And the idea was that the public would have a role to play in the making of the new museum right from the beginning, from the formative ideas to development to delivery and then operations. So we harnessed this idea of human-centered design to mobilize the intellectual, physical and cultural assets as a way to both building cultural heritage but also nurturing community. We held over 100 workshops between 2011 and 2013 to talk about what the place could be. And loads of suggestions were made: a music venue, a contemporary art gallery, a costume museum, and all these ideas were considered. But eventually we synthesized all that and back to its original purpose, as a site that was to honour the city's history of a centre for making. So by the end of 2013, we had some seed funding from Derby City Council of about 150,000. And the ground floor of the Stilton was stripped out and developed as an open and experimental space. And in addition, we built a workshop which included 3D printers, CNC machines, IT with open source software to run laser cutters, lathe saws, and hand tools. And the workshop was created as this public facility and was essential to the principle that community and community building was an essential part of the Museum of Making. Now, we worked with architects Bauman Lyons and Makers and Residents Studio Tilt, and they created opportunities for the community to co-produce plans for fit out and for storytelling. And volunteers designed they designed and made display cases, furniture, and a mobile kitchen. And the collaborative and creative approach and the social networks creation was a prime factor in the national funding bodies coming forward and supporting this project. So in 2015, we had our stage 1 pass for a project that at the time was going to be about 16.4 million. And of that, Heritage Lottery Fund gave us 8.4, Arts Council 2.5. The D2N2 Local Enterprise Partnership, our LEP, gave us 3.7 million, and we had about 400,000 from the City Council. The rest was money that we raised through trusts, foundations, and support from Rolls-Royce. And I'll talk a little bit about that later, the support they gave us there. So in the development phase, we further enshrined this idea of co-production. So we held a series of prototyping workshops which were there to understand the needs of users and types of activities that would be popular in the museum. So one program was the Art of Artifacts, and that was led by the designers that we appointed, Leach, now called Creative Core. And this sought to better understand how audiences might respond to objects in the museum. So the former museum used objects to illustrate a kind of linear narrative of the development of the city. It was very much a sort of great man history of Derby. But participants in the workshop were asked to select and group objects in these makeshift display walls in the way that interested them most. So what seemed to fascinate people was the material shape and form of the objects and what they were made of. And in the end, rather than go for a traditional narrative, we went for a materials taxonomy to explore making in our city, and that came from the public. So from this work, working with the public, but also in the context of a city of makers, engineers, technicians, and craftspeople who in their day jobs may be in sort of white collar roles, but in the evening will tinker around in their sheds, came to our museum and helped us build this new vision. And it drew on the global importance of the site, legacy of 300 years of making, but also the value of involving the community in making, and the imperative of building aspirations in young people. So we ended up with a three sort of legged stool here. We're inspired by the makers of the past, made by the makers of today, and empowering the makers of the future. And that then helped us form some of the key outputs that we wanted from this museum. So the museum was going to make the building fully accessible for the first time. Previously, only the ground and the first floor had been available to the public. We also wanted to make 100% of our collections of making and social history available, because that's the public were telling us that more objects, more stuff. That's how we engage with the past and make our own stories. So there were about 35,000 objects in that collection. We also want to position ourselves as the southern gateway to the Derwent Valley Mills World Heritage Site, a 13-mile World Heritage Site, which starts in Derby and ends up in Matlock Bath and the Cromford Arkwright's Mill in Cromford. All these mills were established in the 18th century, and they together gave birth to the factory system, hence the UNESCO inscription. We also wanted to make sure the building would be environmentally and financially sustainable. And to top that, we wanted to create a new atrium, a new entrance to the museum in a patch of wasteland adjacent to the site. And that was going to be our new civic space for the city. So to achieve all this, we wanted to embed this sort of spirit of collaboration within a procurement process. Now, the procurement world feels mostly skewed towards the construction industry, and it's kind of away from the client. And it was architects Baumann Lyons who first alerted us to the IPI, or integrated procurement model. And this was an innovative procurement project management methodology, which has recently been sponsored by the Cabinet Office. And the Museum of Making is one of only 3 projects to use this method. Now, I'm going to try and attempt to show you a video of explaining what IPI is, and it's probably a much better way of trying to understand it than me describe it. So bear with me while I go on to the internet. Can you hear that, David?
The construction industry is capable of great things, but conventional procurement too often leads to siloed thinking, adversarial behaviours, and consistently poor outcomes for clients. The integrated project insurance model is a new form of insurance-backed alliancing designed to tackle the problem. IPI is underpinned by a unique agreement and insurance that simultaneously aligns and protects the interests of all team members. Its no blame, no claim provisions, freeing the team to collectively focus on the objective of meeting the client's needs. Each alliance member has their direct costs paid, plus a fixed sum to cover corporate overheads and profit. Beyond this, they are incentivised by a gain share, pain share regime linked to the client's target outturn cost. Get it right and the team is in line for a gain share bonus. Get it wrong and the client is protected from unexpected extras costs by the pain share agreement, and everyone else is clear about their maximum liability too. The specially prepared insurance policy not only provides the latent defects warranty, but also underwrites cost overruns beyond the maximum pain share level up to the sum insured. The use of building information modelling is fundamental to the IPI delivery process, supporting collaboration through a common design and development platform. BIM enables IPI, and IPI enables BIM. And it's not just a theory. As part of the government's Trial Projects Delivery Programme, the £11.6 million Advance 2 project at Dudley College has shown how such an alliance can transform outcomes. The Dudley College pilot was completed and opened to students in September 2017. The traditional culture of blame and siloed working has morphed to one of collaboration and integration. Despite a number of challenges, which you can learn more about here, the result is a very happy client and an IPI project team that stands proud of its groundbreaking collaboration and the facility that it has delivered.
So, by and large, that was our experience, and I'll put some flesh on the bones of that presentation. So under the IPI model, rather than there be a contract between the client and the contractors, a virtual company is created. So each organisation, that's the client, main contractor, and all the other team members, which would be mechanical and electrical, structural engineers, and main contractor and exhibition design that become part of an alliance board. And that board appoints an alliance manager. As I said, each member has its direct cost paid, and they're incentivized by the pain and gain share a little bit, I shall tell you about later. To manage this, there is an independent facilitator is appointed, and he or she manages both the alliance board and the next level down, which is the integrated project team. And the integrated project team is the vehicle for which the project is delivered. So Hannah, as our project director, was our representative and the driver within the integrated project team, or the IPT. So unfortunately, we had a slight snag to begin with, in that the insurance product that the model talks about wasn't available to us in its entirety because the museum sits in a floodplain. So we had a modified version of the insurance model, which still covered the liabilities of the contractors. But the key driver was then the pain and gain share mechanism. We appointed the main contractors of a company called Speller Metcalfe, who'd worked on the Dudley College project, and they were experienced in the process, and they worked really hard to support the smaller firms that work with us through the M&E and our structural engineers who hadn't been involved in this sort of project before. Now, to appoint the team, we held a number of some initial behavioural workshops to ensure that collaboration, values and behaviours were absolutely instilled within the alliance itself. And we came up with these STEAM principles, which also refer to our notion of STEAM, which is science, technology, engineering, arts and maths. So we've been using the word STEAM in a number of ways as an mnemonic. But these principles of values and behaviours cut through the alliance and the alliance organisation. So using this methodology, we were able to deliver quite wide-ranging and ambitious objectives. So the project alliance created 55 success criteria, which encapsulated all our objectives around not just the construction, but how the building could be used and how it could operate afterwards. And very important to us was that environmental, social and financial sustainability would be within that. And all 55 of those success criteria, bar one, have been achieved so far. So the project is not quite finished. We used the BREEAM model to ensure that we built this to the highest environmental standards. So we reached very good. And very good is the highest level that a repurposed building can get. So generally, repurposed historic buildings don't get to excellent because of the nature of the original materials. And then lastly, the BIM model, as the video suggested, was really important to creating efficient outcomes for the usability of the building. You see in these pictures here, we've got a changing places loo and a gallery that's built. One of the galleries is built to public indemnity standards, so we can bring in exhibitions from all over the place. So this process kind of really did integrate a commitment to co-production that we'd already begun with our community, so that our contractors and the builders and all the specialists and exhibition designers were absolutely built into, bought into this idea of co-production. So for us, the process, it really did engender joint problem solving. So we encountered a number of problems with the build. We had a large level of asbestos discovered underneath the building. And we felt in a traditional contractor-client relationship that would have pushed the costs over probably an extra £1 million to alleviate. Instead, we came up with a joint solution and saved around about £700,000 on that potential review event. Another solution, joint problem solving, came from the hanging of a 7-ton Trent engine that you can see there, and working with our contractors and Rolls-Royce, we managed to build the museum around the object. And this, this engine sat suspended from the frame of the building for 8 months before we finally put the rest of the building around it. But that had happened because collaboration became absolutely enshrined in the method. Now, previous to this role, I'd worked at a museum called the Museum of East Anglian Life in Stowmarket in Suffolk. I led a £4 million capital programme there at the end of the noughties. And in that small organisation, experience delivering what was for them a very significant project, but it was managed through a traditional procurement method. And I was forever dreading coming to site meetings to hear the next bill going over budget that the contractors were kind of laying on us. The IPI method has meant that conflict has been resolved rather than referring to the contract, but referring to the alliance board and the alliance team. And here the independent facilitator's role was really crucial, chairing meetings, focusing minds, and making sure we ended up producing what was best for project. So up until March 2020, the Museum of Making was on time and it was on budget. It's coming in at 16.4 million, and it was due to open in September 2020. Project was thrown into jeopardy with the lockdown, and the building site was shut for 9 weeks, and a whole range of challenges laid out in front of us: delays, remobilisation, supplier collapse, and the problems with shipping materials. We were 6 months before the building was open, and we hadn't started populating displays or doing the fit out. So the close workings and the collaborative nature of the project meant that our sort of wunderkind QS managed to get all the information together to estimate the final financial consequence of the pandemic in about 4 weeks, really, really quickly. And we were able to shove this really extensive and accurate cost document in front of the HLF, who then granted us another 1.4 million, about 3 months after the initial lockdown back in June 2021. So although the original budget was 16.4 million, it's now gone up to 18 million, but we opened on the 23rd of May 2021. For the client, it's resulted in a wonderful building that's gaining sort of plaudits from the industry, and also the public really enjoy it. For the contractors, the project went into pain. So it went into pain by about £300,000. So each of those contractors then has to pay, and we do pay an additional sum on top of that to cover the pain share. But that would be nowhere near the additional costs that would have otherwise come our way if we'd have been running this under a traditional method. So I think it's been a really exhilarating experience to be part of this project. It's been one of the few building projects in our city that has been on time and more or less on budget. And I think that no doubt is a result of us working to the IPI approach. Thank you.
That's great, Tony. Thank you so much for that. Thank you both of you for really detailed talks. As I said earlier, if anyone does have any questions, please just post them in the chat. There's a few things that I would like to ask you both, if that's okay. Firstly, a really quick one, Tony, about the IPI model. I know you said obviously in Stowmarket you went through the process in a more traditional way. Were there any benefits that you, now looking back on both projects, to doing things traditionally, or would you always recommend using the IPI model?
Well, I mean, I can only go on the two projects, and one was on time and on budget, and one wasn't. So I think we've had a really good experience using IPI. It's only the second time IPI has been used in a construction project. It's a kind of experiment that the Cabinet Office are supporting. The Dudley project had a better outturn than ours did, I suppose, in the great scheme of things. But I felt that the methodology really sat well within the values of our organisation, as an organisation that kind of values collaboration and co-production with our community. I don't think it. I mean, listening to Paul's presentation, I don't think our project is as complicated as yours. And you know, we were restoring an historic building. We did have awkwardness with the fact we have a power station next door to us, and there are things, wave agreements and leases and all sorts of things with Western Power. But beyond that, I think it doesn't sound as technically complicated as the box. But from having led the project on both of those, the IPI model was great. And as I said, great. The client is protected, and our project was on time and on budget, bar COVID.
Thank you for that. As I understand it, obviously, both projects you had to consider existing buildings and you were building a new structure alongside that. Would you both be able to maybe speak to some of the unique challenges of combining the two? I'm sure it would have been a lot easier for you to just start from scratch somewhere and build a museum straight up.
Tony, do you want to go first, or shall I say something?
Do you want to? Yeah.
Yeah, I think. I mean, we also had, it was for us, we had the historic building of the Central Library and the City Museum and Art Gallery, but we also had a public realm outside of that building, and the transformation of a back street into a pedestrianised square. And across from the other side of the square was another listed building, a church, and getting that church back to its original architecture, but being able to use as a contemporary art gallery meant that there was a range of different kind of complications in just in terms of architectural design of what looked right, what in terms of being able to honor the integrity of the original architecture and showcase it better. And not attempt to try and make the contemporary architecture blend in at all, very much to be a contrast to that the architecture of the early 20th century. So I think we've ended up with a really good architectural solution in terms of its aesthetics. But it certainly added to the kind of some of the technical complications and to some of the costs doing it that way.
Mm-hmm. Can I just before you responded to that, Tony, because obviously we've got a question in the chat now from Monique, who says, do you know is IPI modelled only in the UK, or do you know if international projects have also done that?
I don't know whether it's been used internationally. I mean, there's an important point also to make about procurement pre-IPI, in that we still went through the OJU process to procure the contractors, and the building itself is still owned by the City Council. So we had to work with council officers and convince council officers that this novel way of procurement and project management was the best thing to do. And at the beginning, we had really good support from a ace procurement officer at the City Council who was up for anything new. But then during the project, we had people from our property team who were really flummoxed by the methodology and really struggled. So we had to work quite hard to encourage the team from the Council of Property Services to work with us and go on that learning journey.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. I think you mentioned in your talk, Tony, about, I think, did you say IPI was sort of proposed to you by the architect? Is that right? I don't know if you could just speak a little bit more on that. Thomas Power has just sent the message saying, how did you find out about it? So
Arena Bauman, who's an architect based up in Leeds, came across the project. So she is a really interesting architect. She's done a lot of close co-produced projects in other buildings with other clients. Her father was Zygmunt Bauman, the philosopher. So she was a really interesting character. But ironically, the kind of starting point for her was around the insurance package that IPI brought, because Bauman Lyons weren't a big architectural firm. that insurance package felt that it would be more watertight and more protective of her as and her practice. In the end, we couldn't use that particular package to that level of detail, and we had to use a kind of modified version that we negotiated independently with another broker. But originally, the Arena had seen IPI used elsewhere and thought it would be a good idea for this project.
Thank you for that. We've got another question, and I apologise for this, Paul, because I know you said that procurement was a nightmare at the start. But Rhiannon asked if you or Tony have experience of the Brexit changes for procurement.
I don't. To be honest, I don't. I don't tell me you do.
So we procured our work while we were still in the single market. So all the old OJU, procedures were in place at that time. We did have real problems at the back end of 2020 when we left the single market, and we had our front doors on the quayside of a Spanish harbour waiting to be imported. So we had real sort of sticky bum time in March 2021 because we didn't have any front doors, and we were due to open in 6 weeks. But so that was I think that's probably the only real problem that we'd have with Brexit. But yes, I mean, going forward, it's a completely different ball game, I think.
Paul, were you going to add to it?
Yeah, I just wanted to something different actually, just in terms of about COVID and timescales and everything else. I think it's just had very similar issues as Tony in terms of those final few months of trying to complete a project. And I mean, we were always had said from the beginning of the journey that we would be open in the spring of 2020 as part of the Mayflower 400, a flagship for the Mayflower 400 year, and we were just about to, we were on time. We got all the invitations ready to send out for our May the 5th opening of 2020, and then lockdown 1 came. And one of the experiences was all of the people who were fitting out our galleries were Eastern European, the staff, the workers on that, and as soon as there was the threat of flights being cancelled, everyone just fled the site. And so we managed to carry on with the main building contractor on some of the kind of issues that still need to be resolved in terms of the snagging issues for about another 6 weeks. But then supplies ran out, everything, so that we did have to shut down for a period of time, even though building sites were still allowed to be open. So that whole first lockdown period cost us quite a lot of money and increased fees and everything else and so on. So eventually we managed to, and there's quite another complicated long story as how we managed to persuade the workers from Eastern European workers to come back on site and avoid quarantine and everything else and so on. But yeah.
Thank you for that, Paul. I think Tony, you just posted the link in the chat, have you, for the IPI if people want to know more?
I'm not. We're not getting a cut from advertising IPI's work.
Thank you both for that. I think we've now come to the end of the hour, so I better call things a day. Thank you both. So much really talk. Obviously, there aren't too many people who've been in your situation, so it's really interesting to get these insights. As I mentioned earlier, this session has been recorded, and so in a couple of weeks' time, it will be uploaded for anyone who wants to watch it back. And hello to anyone watching in the future on the recording. Thank you again, Tony and Paul. It's been really interesting. And one session left if anyone wants to join us shortly after this. And thank you so much. We'll see you soon.
Thank you.
Thanks everyone.
Bye.
Thank you, Tony. Thanks, Paul.